When we were having that conversation initially, it had a lot to do with being the household manager. A lot of people will hear, well, why don't you just ask me to do something if you want it done? And that's part of the burden, is that you have to be the one that notices when something needs to be done.
I'm Eric Newton, and this is Together, the podcast where we explore the truth about human relationships. As a divorce lawyer, I saw thousands of couples break up firsthand. These days, I'm not so interested in breaking couples up, nor in keeping them together. I'm interested in what our relationships can teach us about ourselves and the world that we live in. So on this show, we have honest conversations with real people about real relationships. There's a conversation that's simmering these days about a concept called emotional labor. It's also sometimes referred to as hidden labor. And in my view, it's an important conversation, well, for a lot of reasons, but not least of which is that having the distinction of emotional labor allows us to have a more integrated and I think deeper experience of our own lives. While being numb to it, on the other hand, means that we're missing out on something that's important to our relationships. Now, rather than define what emotional labor is here in the intro, I'm going to let our guests today, Gemma and Rob Hartley, do that. Gemma's a well-known journalist. She's written for the Washington Post, Glamour, Women's Health, Cosmo, Good Housekeeping, Red Book, and the like. And it was her story about emotional labor in Harper's that went viral and really brought the conversation to the public. Now, she's got a book on the topic coming out from Harper One in the fall of 2018, so keep your eyes out for that. Now, for some background, Gemma and Rob are married. They are high school sweethearts. They've got 2 kids now, and they've been together for over 13 years. So with that, let's go to our conversation with Gemma and Rob Hartley. What's the story behind the emotional labor article?
So the story behind that was the story of me getting frustrated on Mother's Day because I had asked for a cleaning service.
You were more than frustrated.
I was more than frustrated. I feel like frustration is a good word for it. So I had asked for a cleaning service because this was something that I wanted to try out. But I didn't want to do all the work that went into it, calling around and, putting in all the behind the scenes labor for it. And neither did Rob because he did not do that and offered to clean the bathrooms himself instead of, finding and vetting a service to do it. And then he decided to clean the bathrooms on Mother's Day while I was alone with all the kids and tending to all of their needs. And during this process, I found that the gift wrap for all the Mother's Day stuff was in the middle of our closet still and had been there for weeks. And it was just sort of this tipping point of, I'm pulling too much of the emotional labor here. I'm the one that notices when things need to be done. I have to delegate out all the work that I don't want to do myself. And it was just, this frustration that ended in tears and, ultimately a healthy conversation. But
wait, well, let's put it more of a highlight on the frustration that was there, because it wasn't just that the bathrooms weren't clean or that the gifts weren't wrapped. It was that you were expected to do all of the background work and thinking and using up all your intellectual cycle time, in a sense, to get all of those things handled. So Rob's being in the bathroom cleaning stuff on Mother's Day just wasn't cutting it. And for him to not realize that he wasn't cutting it added to that, right?
Yes, it definitely did. I've been talking to a lot of people about emotional labor, including family that hasn't really come across the term before. And I'm sort of describing it as, the unpaid and unnoticed labor that goes into keeping everyone around you really comfortable and happy. Whether that be, managing other people's emotions or, managing their schedules and the calendar, noticing what needs to be done, delegating it out. It's a lot of mental and emotional work that goes into keeping up your relationships and keeping lives running smoothly. And I think a lot of that falls to women, and men don't always notice it. And bringing this up in our relationship really was a huge shift for us where Rob's really started to notice all that work and, is putting it upon himself to do it without being asked or delegated so that that mental load isn't all on me.
Well, what I want to know is when it was Mother's Day and this was all happening and you reached this tipping point where you just couldn't do it anymore and you needed to express how frustrated you were. Did you have a word for this at the time?
I didn't really. I didn't really understand it until that moment happened. I mean, I understood it on a, very deep spiritual level, but I didn't have the right language for it until I really started delving into emotional labor and, how it's being described, how it's being expanded into this, broader topic than it once was.
So when you were having that frustration, I mean, part of the frustration has to do with not knowing how to encapsulate the experience, right? I would guess.
Yeah.
So how did you find your way towards, grasping kind of in the dark for words? How did you find your way towards being able to get the concept across without having heard the term?
I mean, I had heard the term before. I didn't put it together really eloquently until I wrote my article. But when we were having that conversation initially, it had a lot to do with being the household manager, being the person that always notices and always has to ask for things to be done. Knowing that no one else is going to do the work if I don't do it or delegate it. And it was hard. I felt like the conversation went very slowly because I didn't really have the language yet to describe why exactly I was frustrated. Because a lot of people will hear, well, why don't you just ask me to do something if you want it done? And that's part of the burden, is that you have to be the one that notices when something needs to be done.
Right.
And I think that was something that helped, hopefully.
Yeah, definitely. That was when she told me that, and I really started to understand it. It took me a long time to get the whole concept of it, just because I'd never really experienced it on the level she has before.
Well, what was your reaction? I mean, you were in the bathroom scrubbing, thinking you were doing the right thing, right? I mean, did you think was there some part of you that knew you were missing a point, or were you just completely dumbfounded?
Initially, it was just like, I was pretty dumbfounded by the whole thing. I didn't understand it. I was doing what she wanted to get done in the end, but the way I went about it was incorrect. And it took me a while to realize that afterwards. And it was just kind of it's been a really steep learning curve for me.
I
now
can
that
imagine.
I understand where she's coming from and what goes into the day-to-day around the house more even, it's a huge difference. And I really do feel bad about not finding a cleaning service and doing research and everything that she usually does.
Now, there's a place that I've observed a lot of people go in this scenario, and it's not just men, it's whoever is being pointed at and saying, look, you're missing the point here. Like, I understand you're trying to do the right thing, but you're not doing it the right way, and it's making it worse. Please, why can't you see that? When that is first pointed out to someone, I notice that they often become defensive first. there's this, it seems like a knee-jerk need to say, no, 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 I'm not the bad guy. You're the bad guy. You should have articulated it better or something, Did you go there at first? And if not, how did you escape the trap?
I probably did, to tell the complete truth. It's just like, I'm doing it now. What's the problem?
Right.
The expectation versus the result. The expectation was for me to do it her way. The result is that I ignored what she wanted to do and did it my way.
Right. And I like that you guys got to the result, but the fascinating thing to me is that you arrived at this fork in the road. Such a funny phrase, fork in the road. Anyway, you arrived at this choice of pathways. On one hand, you could have listened to her and understood where she was coming from with this complaint, which is what it sounds like you did do. On the other hand, you could have doubled down on your defensiveness, which is what a lot of people do. And that would have created more disconnection, at least for a time. Maybe you would have gotten over it. Maybe you wouldn't have. And I'm curious why you chose the path of listening to her. I want to know what happened in your brain that you realized, oh, wait, she's got something of value to say here.
I've been in that situation before, too, where someone's been very defensive when I've criticized them, and it's taken me a while to actually understand where they're coming from. And being able to take a step back and look at someone else's perspective, really, I think it's an important life skill to have. And it's an extremely important relationship skill.
And so it was basically, you were able to be calm enough to say that to yourself?
Yeah. I've kind of been level-headed my whole life. I have never been like a over-the-top anger kind of person. I was definitely on the defensive at first, but in retrospect, you just have to, listen to your partner or your colleague, anybody, and then be able to accept criticism and also be able to, be in their shoes.
Yeah, amen to that. And now, Gemma, back to you. When you first did deliver this communication and he got defensive, what was your reaction internally or outwardly? What was your reaction to that?
I feel like he's a lot more level-headed than he's even letting on. I don't even recall him being that defensive. Between the two of us, he is the much more calm communicator when it comes to us having these conversations. So I'm sure I was the more worked up one in this situation, and I was trying to calm myself down and explain it in a way that wasn't an attack on him, because it's not an attack on him. It's just a criticism of this sort of social problem that we have, this societal problem we have, where this burden generally gets put on women, and it's something that's really easy for him to miss. It's not like I've tried to have this conversation with him over and over again and it's not sticking. This was really the first time that we'd had it. And I think a large part of that is because he does take on a lot of emotional labor, not the brunt of it up until now, but it hasn't been a point of frustration to the point where I've needed to bring it up for the past 13 years. So obviously he's doing pretty well.
Right.
But I think when he did get a little bit defensive about it, I sort of went deeper into emotional labor mode, where I'm trying really hard to manage my own emotions, so that he can hear me. Instead of hearing that, hey, you're doing everything wrong, this is your fault, you're not hearing me. I really am trying to frame that conversation in a way that he can hear me. And that I think that's a big part of emotional labor too, is that when you go to talk about emotional labor with your partner, it becomes emotional labor because it's natural to want to jump to that defensive and say, no, no, I'm not the problem. And so you kind of have to cushion your response in a way that makes it palatable to the other person.
Yeah. And it strikes me that there's an important distinction to be dug out of what you just said. The way we often hear about the concept of emotional labor is in this unilateral sense. I'm the one who's conducting emotional labor for the sake of our relationship, and the balance is unfair, and I need you to share some of it, is kind of how it's approached. But you're almost saying, well, not only does it require emotional labor to even talk about emotional labor, but even on a grander scale, it requires emotional labor to have good communication, period, on
Yeah.
both parties' behalf.
Yeah, I absolutely believe that's true. And I think emotional labor gets a bad rap because we get caught up in these frustrations so often. But I think it's really a skill set of caring, and it's it's a very important skill set to have. Emotional labor is not something to be viewed solely as a burden. If it's shared well and harnessed in the right way, I think it's really valuable. And definitely within a relationship is something that everyone needs to be doing.
Yeah. I only thought of the term, I only thought of the word in the sense of this specifically emotional, these stereotypically emotional experiences. But you've got a broader definition, it sounds like to me. It's not just the feelings, it's also the administration of a life. It's also all of the tasks and processes that go into sort of just upholding an ongoing kind of structure between multiple people. Am I
Yeah.
taking it too far, or is that right?
No, that is absolutely right. And, it's been criticized that perhaps emotional labor is not the best term. Uh, but I think that if we expand it in this way, that it still makes sense, because it is that unpaid, unnoticed labor that goes into keeping everyone comfortable, keeping them happy. That doesn't just include the purely emotional interactions. That includes a lot of other things that we sometimes refer to as the mental load or invisible labor. But they all come from this same skill set of caring about the way things are done, caring about how it affects other people. It's really that you want things done well and in a way that will benefit others as well as yourself.
Which you're saying is something that we should cherish.
Yes, absolutely. I think we need to balance it probably a little better in most relationships, but I think it is something to be cherished and something to be viewed as a positive asset in any relationship or even in the workplace. When you're doing emotional labor, it's doing things with care and doing things in a thoughtful way, and it's a real asset.
So then, what's the? It sounds like you're saying the bottom line is almost two steps. It's one, notice and acknowledge that this is a thing that occurs, and by distinguishing it, we bring more awareness to our relationships and our own life experience. And then two, work to balance it.
Yeah.
Is that
And if
right?
I were if I were to add a three, it would be, to really have everyone own it. Not to view emotional labor purely as a burden, but as something that we can really harness in a way that helps our relationships and improves our lives, because I really think it does.
So then now that you guys have this distinction, how do you use it? Is it the sort of thing where you're going along in your daily experience and then you'll notice that you're the one doing emotional labor, and Rob, you might say, hey honey, I think I'm doing the emotional labor here, and I just want to point it out, or like what actually happens now in reality?
I think I address it more of a shared burden now than a one-sided thing. I try to be more proactive when it comes to seeing things that need to be done and doing some planning, and even just grocery shopping with the kids while she's working or taking them to gymnastics. It's just that kind of stuff. We're taking on more of it, and I sometimes I feel overwhelmed, and if I communicate that, then Gemma's like, "Yeah, let me, step up and help you more."
Yeah, I think in the day to day it looks different in that we are communicating about emotional labor a lot more. So I'm no longer assuming that I need to take the brunt of emotional labor. I'm able to expect him to do more. And I also feel like he's noticing a lot more of what I do around the house. And when I am performing emotional labor, he is much more attuned to that and much more likely to bring it up than he was before, and much less likely to bring it up when he is doing it himself. And I,
Well, that last one is an interesting point. Is that because before it was distinguished, and he felt overwhelmed, he would point to it or something? Or like, what is that?
Before I would point to, "Hey, I'm doing this, this, and this, and this," and give me praise for it.
yeah.
And now it's I do this, 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 and this, and I kind of keep my mouth shut and just take care of business now. It's more of I don't need the validation anymore. And I don't want the validation anymore.
Now that's interesting, because it seems like there's nothing wrong with validation in and of itself. Like, in fact, that's a good thing. But what I'm trying to tease out here is, I think what I'm hearing is that you're saying I was needing validation, but simultaneously being unaware of how much she was doing on her end.
Exactly, and I wasn't giving, the same praise as I was expecting.
Right.
Which is just so crazy now that I think, what was I back then,
Yeah. I mean,
anything, it's a lot better since.
it's so good. We're all such narcissists deep down, but it can be dissolved if we just point the light of awareness at it. You sort of like, oh wait, yeah, that's right. I don't need to be such a narcissist here.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's lovely. Okay. Well, gee, so it sounds like it's uptick the quality of your life. And then I guess the last thing about it with you guys is it sounds also like a lot of the emotional labor in your relationship is administrative. It's daily tasks of the family, and it's the steps that go into those tasks that aren't obvious on the surface. And
yeah, that more mental load side of it is definitely what has bogged us down in the past, more than the communicating and that end of emotional labor.
Right. So that was the area that needed work, and it's made a huge, vast improvement. Have you noticed improvements in the other area?
Yeah, I would say. I mean, our communication, I wouldn't say has ever suffered greatly, but it has gotten better, especially in regards to emotional labor. It's something that we're talking about all the time now. One, because I'm really into the subject right now, but also because, he's taken on that steep learning curve and has made it very clear that he's open to hearing what I have to say about it. And
right.
That's a really important aspect.
Gemma, I wonder what you would do in the specific scenario that I have in mind.
All right.
Tell me how you would apply the tool in this case. So let's imagine there's a couple, and one person in the relationship is having a very, very hard time, and the other person in the relationship is spending a lot of their energy maintaining emotional equilibrium for the first person and for their relationship. And the person who's doing that work of maintaining the equilibrium loves their partner, does want to maintain the equilibrium, but is also really feeling the burden of, in some sense, at least for a period of time, always being the one who has to do that. I can imagine being the person bearing that load in that moment and saying, I don't know if I want to bring this up with my partner who's having a hard time, because that just layers another burden on them and makes it harder for them to deal with their challenges. Do you have a perspective on how and when to bring the topic up?
Well, in that scenario, I'm not going to say like, hey, it's time to talk about all the emotional labor I'm putting in, because that is a very sensitive time, and it's not the time for that conversation. Sometimes there needs to be times where you're willing to bear the brunt of that. It's really a back and forth, I think. And there are absolutely situations where you will take on most of the emotional labor, and it's not necessarily a bad thing to do it, and to do it without complaint for a time for the sake of the person you love. When you're in a relationship where everything is just kind of fine, and there's just an unfair balance in your relationship for no other reason than this is the way it's always been, then I think broaching the subject shouldn't be as hard. But I would highly suggest not doing it when you're angry and crying about the bathroom cleaning like I
did. It worked out, but probably not the best approach.
It did, but I would advise against that. I would go back in time and wait a few hours and think through my emotions before approaching it the way I did.
And then how should one approach it?
That's tricky.
Yeah, I think it really depends on your relationship and your partnership. I would hope that, you could bring it up in a way that the other person could understand. Hopefully you'll know your partner well enough to approach it in a manner that's not going to end in a fight. And I feel bad saying that, because this is, like, hey, take on some more emotional labor to talk about emotional labor. But, I think if you're going to have the conversation, you're going to have to get on board with that fact that you're going to need to put in the effort to really make it stick.
Yeah, it makes me think of the situation that my own fiance is in right now in her business. She needs more employees because she's just got too much work, but she knows that the process of hiring and then training an employee is going to double her workload for a period of time. So she's never willing to do it. So she keeps kicking the can down the road, and things become worse and worse. And eventually she knows that she just has to face the fact that she's going to have to double her workload if she wants to cut her workload down.
Yes, and I think it's very similar with emotional labor. Like, yeah, you're going to have to put in the effort up front. You're going to put in some more emotional labor to talk about it and hopefully make it better for your relationship. But, the good news is for women approaching that conversation, you're already really good at emotional labor. So, you've got the upper hand there.
I kind of liked the rip off the Band-Aid approach to it. For me, it's easier to just, have it all in my face at once and be able to process that. that conversation all at the same time instead of over time here and there. It does depend on your partner, though.
Yeah, I'm glad you're not a delicate snowflake in that regard.
This conversation invariably gets cast as a gender dynamic, and there's certainly some truth to that, but I'm not sure that fundamentally it's really a conversation about man or women. What's clear to me is that we all need acknowledgement for what we do, and we need parity in our relationship dynamics or they break down. Now, I rang Gemma just before recording this bit to learn if anything had changed in their relationship since we recorded the interview, and she's nearly done with her book, and what she told me is that the conversation about parity, about emotional labor in all its forms, is just never over. It's not as if simply bringing up the concept means that it's done, and there was some part of her that thought that was the case when this all began. But what she's learned is that it's a constant balancing act, that the opportunity on the other side of the conversation is about deeper involvement in our own lives, and that failing to be aware of the emotional labor component of a relationship means that we're robbing ourselves of something critical about our experience of being in love and being together. You know, in my view, we're all going to die. So why not be involved with our lives while we've got them? If you liked what you heard today, please support us. It's not free to produce this show, and I would love your support. You can support us by going to our Patreon page at patreon.com/together. There's links to that in our show notes and also on our webpage, together.guide. If you've got questions or comments, or if you'd like to connect, you can find us on social media. Our Facebook page is facebook.com/togethershow. Twitter and Instagram are both at @together_show. And you can always email me at host@together.guide. The music in today's episode is by blue.sessions, and you can find them at sessions.blue. Thanks for your amazing music, guys. All right, that's it. Talk to you next week.